Welcome to everyone who is joining us on Zoom. Our meeting will begin at 3 o'clock. We're so glad you're here. Welcome, everybody. If you are joining us on Zoom, I invite you to put in the chat your name and where you're joining us from. We're really glad you're here, and we'll start the event shortly. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have you all here with us. Welcome. If you're just joining us on Zoom, I invite you to put your name and where you're from in the chat as we all gather. We'll be starting the event shortly. Welcome, everybody, both on Zoom and YouTube, and all hopefully in the comfort of our warm homes. It is so wonderful to have so many people here with us online, even though we could not be together as we had hoped in person due to the blizzard that's bearing down across the East Coast. But it's delightful to have us all here together today. Really thankful to be here with our featured author, Donn Mitchell, the author of Eleanor Roosevelt's Nightly Prayer, Lynn Ruggiero, who is the vice chair of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill, and all of you from, it looks like, as far away as close to home as Hyde Park, and I see someone in Colorado. I see folks joining from all over the Diocese of New York and all over the country. So this is really wonderful. So I am the Reverend Meredith Cadet Sanderson. I am the rector of St. James Church in Hyde Park. We are so pleased and proud to partner with the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill to host this event and to hear today about Eleanor Roosevelt's spirituality, which was formed here in our own Episcopal Diocese of New York at a number of churches, which included St. James Hyde Park. The rector here presided at her burial locally in Hyde Park. And this is a season where Eleanor Roosevelt's faith has, I think, inspired many of us who've read Donn's book. I'm not going to say lengthy remarks, but I will say that having read the whole book and all the way up through the epilogue, in the closing paragraph of the book, Mr. Mitchell quotes from Adlai Stevenson's words at Eleanor Roosevelt's memorial at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. And Stevenson said of Eleanor Roosevelt that she possessed a luminous faith that testified always to sanity in an insane time and to hope in a time of obscure hope. And those of us at St. James and here in Hyde Park who gathered to read this book found ourselves very moved by Mrs. Roosevelt's life, by the sanity of her activism, and by the vision of a world made new, for which she never ceased to strive. And one of the reasons in the Episcopal Church that we do name and lift up together people who are saints of God, and there's a group in our diocese, many of you are here, who are working to have Mrs. Roosevelt added to the calendar of saints in our church, is because these human beings are luminaries on behalf of Christ, who inspire us all, as the prayer book says, in our several callings, to do the work that God gives us to do in our own time. And I want to thank all of you for being here for this conversation. And I want to thank Mr. Mitchell for writing such an extraordinary and inspiring book that has given many of us hope, and has kept us grounded in the sanity of the gospel. And we are grateful to you for that. Before I'm going to recognize Lynn Ruggiero to say a few words about the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill. Before I do that, I just want to make a few housekeeping type announcements. You'll notice you're free to put questions in the chat. After Mr. Mitchell speaks, then we'll take questions. You can either put a question in the chat or you can use the raise hand function if you're with us on Zoom. And to do that, if you look on your screen, you'll see a button called React. And if you click that, you'll see an option to raise your hand. And when it's time for Q&A, we'll use that function so that people can sort of get in line to ask a question virtually. So at this time, I'm going to ask Lynn Ruggiero, who is the Vice President of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill, to unmute and to say a few words. Welcome, Lynn, and thank you.
Thank you. First, I'll start with Eleanor Roosevelt's quote of, "You do things that you're most afraid of." This is not my preferred way of presenting to a group, but here I am. It's a privilege to be here as part of the St. James Church event with author Donn Mitchell and with Reverend Meredith and the Hyde Park Parish, which is so important to the Roosevelts and to the town of Hyde Park. I'm pleased to represent ERVK, known as the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill, as the vice chair of the board of directors and a partner at this event. Eleanor Roosevelt was arguably the most consequential First Lady of the United States. She also was considered to be the First Lady of the world. It is more than impressive that more than 60 years after her death, she still inspires people around the world. I have met people on travels locally and abroad who have told me of their admiration of ER and how she continues to inspire them even today. She inspired individuals as well as heads of governments and states and local leaders. The world needs Eleanor Roosevelt now. This does not mean that she did not give the world a moral compass of dignity and respect for all people. It means that we are humans and therefore continue to make mistakes, needing reminders and instigators and activists like Eleanor Roosevelt to continue to develop a better country and world through her moral compass. This is what we are doing at ERVK. It is the mission of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill to keep Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy alive, relevant, and active. Moral leadership, self-confidence, and value-based actions are so needed for individuals and the greater society. ER was committed to dignity for all, including the dignity of work itself. She was committed to human rights for all, equality of treatment and opportunity for all people. She strongly believed in the essential importance of education, libraries, and teaching, advocacy and social action, justice, and laws to ensure fair treatment. These are the bases for programs within the current redesigned and evolving ERVK. We are developing educational programs for opportunities for high school students who might need extra resources and assistance to develop their dreams and plans for their future. Personal growth and development for personal agency. This is essential for the participation in our democracy and therefore needed in civic education and civic involvement. These are what we're focusing on. As Donn Mitchell will discuss, ER has a strong motivation and guidance through her religion and commitment to the universality of human rights, believing all people should be treated with dignity and respect and have opportunities for self-fulfillment. ER left us a legacy and guiding principles to continue her work, which has become the work of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill. I'm very happy to be here and thank you for this opportunity.
Lynn, thank you so much.
Welcome.
Before I introduce Mr. Mitchell to speak to us about his book, after which we'll move into Q&A. We are Episcopalians and we do love to pray. So I'm going to invite us all to pause for a moment of prayer. And the prayer that we are going to offer here is Eleanor's nightly prayer. And if you have your own copy of the book with you, you can find this on page 2 if you want to read along. Let us pray. Our Father, who has set a restlessness in our hearts and made us all seekers after that which we can never fully find, forbid us to be satisfied with what we make of life. Draw us from base content and set our eyes on far-off goals. Keep us at tasks too hard for us, that we may be driven to thee for strength. Deliver us from fretfulness and self-pitying. Make us sure of the good we cannot see and of the hidden good in the world. Open our eyes to simple beauty all around us, and our hearts to the loveliness men hide from us because we do not try to understand them. Save us from ourselves and show us a vision of a world made new. May the spirit of peace and illumination so enlighten our minds that all life shall glow with new meaning and new purpose through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I am now so pleased to welcome author Donn Mitchell. As many of you know, Donn is a professor currently teaching at Fordham University. He has published work in a variety of publications, including The Christian Century, The Living Church, and the Anglican Theological Review. This book, Eleanor Roosevelt's Nightly Prayer, is his new book published in November of last year. He's also the author of a book on Francis Perkins. We love Francis Perkins. The book is called Tread the City's Streets Again. Francis Perkins shares her theology. And Donn has also taught at Manhattan College and the General Theological Seminary in New York City and at Princeton Theological Seminary. And he is a member of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, worshiping at the Church of the, oh, Donn, you're going to have to correct me, Transfiguration or Incarnation in Manhattan, but you'll tell us. And so please join me in thanking and welcoming Donn Mitchell.
Thank you very much. My parish of record is the Church of the Holy Apostles, but I am part of a morning prayer group at the Church of the Transfiguration, which is also known as Little Church around the corner. So I have multiple parishes. I'm almost like Eleanor in that regard because she racked up quite a few, and she had simultaneous memberships in parishes. Um, so thank you all for tuning in. I was looking forward to being there in person. I have visited the church, but not worshiped there. But I did zoom in a while ago. I forget when that was. And then I zoomed in this morning as well to kind of refresh my sense of what it looks like. And now I'm getting to see some people as well. So that's very, very good to know. People ask me how I got started on Eleanor Roosevelt, and it's actually because I have been working for so many years on Frances Perkins, who I discovered really before I even went to seminary and really even knew how to do historical research and that kind of thing. But I have written a little book about her called Tread the City Streets Again, and am hoping to do a larger book that is sort of a religious interpretation of the New Deal. Now, whenever I speak about Francis, I would get questions about Eleanor, and I would answer them as best I could, but then I would try to go back and look it up and see if I could get a more informed answer. One of the things that I kept finding over and over again in the literature is that the biographers tend to say that she overcame a narrow religious upbringing to become a great humanitarian. Well, she certainly did become a great humanitarian, but the thing that I kind of suspected was having been baptized at a church on Park Avenue and confirmed at a church on Madison Avenue, she probably did not have a narrow religious upbringing. I knew enough about Calvary Park Avenue and Incarnation Madison Avenue to know that they were certainly not backwaters. And I think probably people who've never been to New York know that Madison Avenue and Park Avenue are not backwaters. But what I wanted to do was to challenge that idea that she overcame a narrow upbringing, narrow religious upbringing, and also try to find out where that idea comes from. And some of it just comes from plain old ignorance, if I can, if I dare say that. I remember reading, there's an Eleanor Roosevelt encyclopedia, and there was an entry about the religion of Eleanor Roosevelt, and it said she wasn't really religious. She had a sort of abstracted Episcopalianism. And I thought, oh God, that would probably require a root canal to remove. It sounds like such a horrible thing to have. Um, I think, I don't know what he meant, actually, so I won't attempt to interpret it. But I think that there is a misunderstanding about what the Episcopal Church is actually like. There are all kinds of stereotypes afoot about what religious people are like. And I think you could probably even name a lot of the stereotypes. You know, there's the busybody, there's the stern disciplinarian, the disapproving person, the very naive, easily shocked person, the spooky person who's always hearing voices and looking heavenward. Um, None of those things were characteristic of Eleanor, but in many respects, she was very characteristic of the Episcopal Church. And so, what I've tried to show in the book is that, in fact, a great deal of what she advocated, a great deal of what she became as a person, really has its genesis in her religious heritage. She was baptized, excuse me, by Henry Yates Satterley, and if that name doesn't ring a bell, I'll tell you who he was. He was a great preacher and a renowned clergyman in New York City, but he became the first bishop of Washington. In the late 19th century, the church decided that we needed to raise our profile on public issues and specifically national issues. And the idea emerged to create a Diocese of Washington and to build what has become Washington Cathedral or the National Cathedral. And the presiding bishop would be restyled as the Archbishop of the United States. Well, the last part didn't happen, but the other two parts did. And in fact, Henry Yates Satterley laid the cornerstone of Washington Cathedral when Eleanor was 24. And the other person who joined him in laying the cornerstone was Eleanor's godfather, Teddy Roosevelt, who at that time was president of the United States. So she had I think, an upbringing that really placed religious consciousness in the center of public life and was very concerned about how we make a witness in a free society, how we stand for what we stand for without trampling on other people's rights or their freedom of belief, what kinds of things we lift up, what kinds of things we articulate as Christians. Now, just to tell you a little bit about her, because people say, well, she was baptized by Henry VIII Satterley, so how well did she know him? Well, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Calvary, and I'll just read a section from my book, if I can find it. I did mark it, but sometimes my markings are not always as reliable. Excuse me. Satterley's Calvary was abuzz with social mission when baby Eleanor arrived. Two missions serving the poor of Manhattan's East Side were created to supplement the work of an existing city mission sponsored by the parish. The Olive Tree Inn was created to offer temporary lodging to the poor. Other activities included a working men's club with 300 members and a ministry to women in prison, a coffee house, a free reading room, and a gymnasium and bowling alley rounded out the parish's work. Now, in addition to being in a parish that had so much involvement in social mission, you still might say, well, she was a little girl. What did she know about that? Well, her father, Eliot, was very committed to those social missions and took 5-year-old Eleanor to a homeless shelter to help serve Thanksgiving dinner. Her uncles took her to the Bowery Mission and to a homeless shelter in Hell's Kitchen to sing Christmas carols. And she also, her grandmother took her to decorate a Christmas tree in the baby's ward at the orthopedic hospital. And this was all before she turned 8 years old. And she does say in her some of her reflections that there was really never a time when she was not aware that there were a lot of people less fortunate than she and her family were. And that pretty much from the get-go, from baptism forward, she knew that she had a duty to the community, a duty to care about all these people who were less well off. Now, in addition to that, Henry Yates Satterley also wrote a Sunday school curriculum that was published, and happily it survives. And it says boys and girls must learn to understand that the Christian vocation is to serve the community. And so even in Sunday school, she was getting that. And she really emerges as what I would say a really obedient kind of Christian. She ingested those concepts, and then she was alert to what was going on in the world and where those kinds of concepts could be applied. Now, where I think this business comes from about her having a narrow upbringing is an interpretation of her grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall. Eleanor experienced tremendous tragedy at the age of 8. Her mother died, and then a year later, her younger brother died, and by the end of that same year, her father died. And so she had tremendous traumatic losses, very, very close together, between the ages of 8 and 10. And she was required to go live with her grandmother, Mary Hall, who was kind of a stern disciplinarian. And she did require daily Bible reading and prayer meetings and that sort of thing. But Eleanor doesn't really complain so much about that. She complains about the fact that she had to take cold sponge baths because Grandmother Hall thought that was good for your health, and she, objected to some of that. Also, Grandmother Hall restricted Eleanor's social life very severely. So that she didn't go to public school or any school. She was tutored privately, but it was not a one-on-one situation. She had frequently cousins or neighbor children that Mrs. Hall had selected were in kind of a hand-picked classroom. So her social life was limited until the age of 15 when she went abroad to study at Allenswood School. And a lot of the biographers look at Marie Silvestri, who was the headmistress who had founded the school, and a remarkable woman, very progressive and enlightened, and a very demanding educator. And a lot of the biographers seem to suggest that she got her social conscience from Marie Silvestri. I don't think that's accurate. I think she already had it when she got there. But what Marie did that was so significant, apart from the actual substantive education, was that she held up a mirror to Eleanor and said, "Look at yourself. Look at what you can do." She had really, her father just had great hopes for her, thought she was just a fascinating little girl. But then she lost that source of support. And so from age 10 to 15, she was kind of isolated and she was not getting the reinforcement that might have caused her to blossom. But under Marie Silvestri's tutelage, she got that reinforcement, and she decides that she doesn't really want to be a debutante. Her grandmother insists that she has to be, because that's what women in their social class did. So she came back to New York and she had the debut, but she immediately started working in a settlement house. She joined the Junior League, which was formed by her friend Mary Harriman, who later was known as Mary Harriman Rumsey and was also close to Frances Perkins. But she started going into the tenement houses, and she later started working for the National Consumers League. And when she started dating Franklin, she also took him into the tenement houses. So he had done some social work under the auspices of Endicott Peabody, who was the headmaster at Groton. But what he saw in Groton, Massachusetts, was nothing like what he saw on the Lower East Side, with Eleanor pointing the way to him. She was already familiar with it, already unafraid of something that most young women would be afraid of. She was going into neighborhoods that were dangerous. And she was very obviously from a different social status, that the way she dressed and the way she carried herself and the way she spoke, it's pretty obvious that she was not one of the locals on the Lower East Side. And yet she, despite the fact that she was vulnerable in those ways, she made it her business to do constructive work in those areas. Now, the thing is, we might say that Grandmother Hall's effect on Eleanor was negative or maybe retarding in some way. But Grandmother Hall was the one who was the member of the Church of the Incarnation on Madison Avenue, where Eleanor was confirmed. So from age 8, she was in Incarnation. And even though the change of lifestyle from living with her parents to living with her grandmother may have been very different, the change to Incarnation was more of the same. Incarnation was also a parish that had a huge social mission project. And just to give some examples, the year before Eleanor was born, the parish had developed something called the Niobrara League, which was an outreach program to American Indians. The next year, the parish created the St. Augustine League as a mission to African Americans. The Montgomery Memorial Society from 1874 was a mission to Mexicans. In 1882, the parish created the Bethlehem Day Nursery to care for the children of working women. There was also the Ladies Employment Society and the St. Luke's Society supporting St. Luke's Hospital. There was a summer camp for children who would have been on the streets when school was out. All kinds of supportive ministries, social outreach ministries. The rector, when she first arrived there, was also a leading advocate of education for women, higher education for women, and was one of the founders of Barnard College, which is now partnered with Columbia University. So she had, I think, a very sophisticated exposure. And her family was involved. So it wasn't just that she saw it or heard it. She was encouraged to get involved in it herself, to get some hands-on experience. And what is also significant is has just slipped my mind. I'm sorry. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But yes, what is also significant is that in addition to this exposure to social activity and all that sort of thing in the Parises, by the time she was 8 years old, she had already been to Europe twice. And her father had taken her on a gondola ride and sung in Italian with the gondoliers. She had a vivid memory of seeing a petrified loaf of bread when her father took her to see the ruins of Mount Vesuvius. And he stressed that these were real people leading real lives just like you and me. And that was something that stayed with her. And I think at every step of the way, when we look at her, she is always seeing the human being as a human being, not a statistic, not a resource, not even a voter or a consumer or something like that. She's always seeing them as people, and I really appreciate that about her. And I think it is the strongly incarnational theology that was prevalent in the Diocese of New York, still is. And I think she took it to heart. And I think she was able to interpret it in ways that were very significant. So what I'll do at this point is pause. And if you have any questions, Meredith, or if people want to ask questions, there's much more I can say. And questions tend to stimulate a lot of that because I've left out quite a bit in this attempt to introduce the topic that the book covers. I will just say that the prayer itself was not Eleanor's own creation. It was written by Oliver Hart, who was the rector of St. John's Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. in 1940. And it was drafted for the occasion of one of the anniversaries of FDR's inauguration. He always had a church service anniversary observance. The first one was at Washington Cathedral, but then in subsequent years, it was just easier to go across the street to Lafayette Square. But Eleanor was so taken by the prayer that she published it in her My Day column, and she then incorporated it into her daily religious praxis. And one of the reasons that I think it impressed her so much is that it really crystallized a lot of things that she already believed. The thing about fear is something that comes through in her diaries and her writings, poetry that she enjoyed and sometimes carried copies of it in her purse. So it resonated with her on a lot of levels. And so what I have done in the book is taken some themes from the prayer and built chapters around them. But the prayer really comes as sort of a ratification of those themes in her life. So, Meredith.
Thank you so much, Donn. So I'm going to remind folks that if you have a question, we would love to hear it. So please use the raise hand function, or you can leave a question in the chat. And I see that Danny has raised their hand and has a question. So I'm going to go ahead and invite you to unmute. Danny, you can go ahead whenever you're ready. Looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. So Danny, we'll come back to you. Christine, I'm going to invite you to unmute.
This is a little, not exactly on topic, but are you familiar with a thing that happens every year at Lent called Lent Madness?
Yes.
So do you know that Francis Perkins won the Golden Halo a few years ago?
Yes, I do know that. Yeah. I was very happy about that too, because one of the reasons why I always got Eleanor Roosevelt questions in my Frances Perkins presentations is that Eleanor has name recognition that Frances really did not have. She still does not have it as much as she ought to. But there has been a lot of progress made with the development of the Frances Perkins Center, which is the in Newcastle, Maine, which was the family homestead, which was passed down to her mother and then to her, and then to her grandson, Tomlin, who sadly just passed away in December. But happily, he was present to see it designated as a national monument. So they're doing a lot of good educational work on Frances. And of course, she is in the church calendar, although not too many people seem to know that. So we're always trying to get people to promote it. And I think, as Meredith said, Eleanor certainly belongs there as well. And I think Frances, for what she did for our social safety net and that sort of thing. Eleanor, for what she did for the world in terms of the Universal Declaration.
Thank you, Donn, and thank you, Christine, for your question. Our next question was in the chat from Liz and Dan Strickland. They asked, do we have any details about the daily prayer routine that Eleanor Roosevelt practiced? We all want to steal her daily prayer routine, whatever it was, right?
Yes.
What can you share with us about her prayer life?
Well, I think in addition to the nightly prayer, another prayer that was very important to her was the prayer attributed to Saint Francis of Assisi. And there again, I think you could probably write a whole book about that as a theme in her life. The very first phrase, "Make me an instrument of your peace," that is exactly what she became. And the achievement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has probably done more for peace than anything else that human beings have come up with anyway. So that was certainly part of her life. She was a Bible reader, and she read the Bible every day. One wonders if she really needed to, because she had memorized a great deal of it. But excuse me, I recall meeting Father Warren, who was director of the Church of the Resurrection on the East Side a few years ago. That was Frances Perkins's parish. And he said to me that the lore in the parish was a joke, but it was truthy, the way Stephen Colbert would say, is that Frances Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt were both Episcopalians, but they were different religions. Okay. And, it's one of those things, if you unpack it, I mean, Frances was an Anglo-Catholic. She was really steeped in sacramentalism. She drew a lot of her inspiration from Thomas Aquinas and from Pope Leo XIII, who issued the famous social encyclical Rerum Novarum, and some of the popes that came after him. Eleanor was more likely to draw from mainline Protestantism, although she has a sacramental aspect of her life as well. And in fact, she uses sacramental language quite often in discussing community life. But again, in terms of what her focus was, I'm inclined to say, well, Frances was sacramental and Eleanor was biblical, but that's actually too broad a sweep. She was about the teachings of Jesus. And that's what comes through over and over and over again. And if you read her My Day column, she wrote this column 6 days a week for 30 years. She mentions Jesus about 900 times in the columns, frequently quoting his sayings. And her whole book, The Moral Basis of Democracy, makes the point that she made in some other places, is that the life of Christ is the necessary pattern for democracy. Not that we all have to be Christians, but that we all have to live with concern about the well-being of our neighbor. We have to love each other. It's the only way democracy can work. And I think some of what we're seeing now has been a kind of loss or a retreat of love. And that's one of the reasons why I think we are having the difficulties we're having right now. So I don't know. She did in one of her later memoirs, she talked about reading the Bible before bed and falling asleep before she'd actually finished reading what all she wanted to read. But again, as I say, she had memorized so much of it that it was probably just a devotional praxis for her.
Thank you for that wonderful answer. And thank you, Liz and Dan, for your question. Leonard, please go ahead and ask your question. Well,
Okay, am I unmuted now? Yes.
Yes.
Take a moment. I'm very intrigued to know more about your work on Frances Perkins. I hope you'll put me on your mailing list about that. I encountered Frances Perkins' work years ago. I don't know if you know Spence Porter is a playwright who's written a play about Frances Perkins,
Oh.
which I encountered as I was writing about Emma Goldman. There's an intersection between Frances Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt that involves Emma Goldman. Well, there's several intersections. I mean, there's this New Deal, there's the Triangle Fire. I wrote an opera about that too. But my favorite quote, one of my favorite quotes of Eleanor Roosevelt happened when Frances Perkins allowed Emma Goldman to return to America for 90 days and was almost impeached. And
Yeah.
Eleanor Roosevelt spoke up and said, Emma Goldman is an old woman. She was 64. She's coming to America to sell copies of her book and give lectures. I think the country will survive.
And Frances, in justifying her decision, I love what she said as well. She said, she's just an old woman who wants to see her friends again before she dies. Can't we allow her that?
Yeah,
You know,
right.
and I think that both Frances and Eleanor, and this is certainly germane to our Episcopal heritage, is they speak in terms of relationship. That is really the emphasis. We're not so much about right dogma the way some other religious traditions are. Not that we don't care about it, but that's not really sort of the test of what it means to be a Christian. The test for us is relationality. Loving each other, getting along with each other. And I remember Frances. Related this story of what it was like when the GM sit-down strike was occurring. And the CEO and all the top brass from GM came down to her office demanding that President Roosevelt call out troops to make the people go back to work. And the way she dealt with it was entirely in terms of relationship. She said, look, you're the one who wants these people to work for you. I don't care if they work for you or not. They say they don't want the terms you offer. Go talk to them, find out what they want, and see if you can't work something out. And this went around and round, but finally, that's what they did. I mean, she wore them down. But she always spoke in terms of relationship. And we see that in Eleanor as well. And this idea that we should all, and that in fact we must all live with a concern for the well-being of our neighbor is basically about right relationship.
thank you. And thank you, Leonard, for your question. Our next question comes from the chat from Colleen. She said, I have a question about if anything came up in your research about how Eleanor felt about some of the struggles in her marriage, and especially the infidelity, and how prayer might have helped her find peace with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a two-part question. And this came up in our discussion here at St. James as well.
Yeah.
And the second part of the question is to address how did the church feel about same-sex relationships at the time? And what do you know about Mrs. Roosevelt's position, especially given her close relationship with Lorena Hickok?
Mm-hmm.
So, two-part question.
Right. Well, part of the reason why you don't find much exploration of either of those topics in my book is that there has been a lot written about them, and particularly the relationship with Lorena Hickok is the subject of a book by one of my associates, Susan Quinn, who also wrote a history of the Federal Theater Project. That's how I got to know her. And so I decided that I didn't have anything new to offer because I hadn't really read the diaries and the letters and that sort of thing that went into the research for that book. And of course, a great deal has been written about Lucy Mercer and the affair there. And I decided that I didn't find anything that was really germane to the religious aspect of things. I think she certainly was disappointed and perhaps heartbroken. But the thing that was true of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt is that they really did love each other. They were fond of each other. They may not have been romantic partners forever or for very long. I mean, they did have 5 children. So I mean, there was something, it was going. It was actually 6 children, one of whom died in infancy. So I mean, there certainly was a marital relationship there, but it continued on sort of different terms. They really admired each other, and they became partners in the work they sought to do. And one of the things that I found so interesting, and I devote a good portion of time to it in the book, is that she's out there campaigning for him to, win the presidency and all that sort of thing. And she's horrified by the idea that she's going to be first lady. She doesn't want to do that. She's happy to help him become president, but she doesn't want to be first lady. And one of the things she does is she was just forming her friendship with Lorena Hickok at the time. And the day before the inauguration, they slip out to visit a sculpture in Rock Creek Park that has been very meaningful to Eleanor. And in the sculpture is called Grief, and it's a portrayal of a woman grieving, and there's a picture of it in my book. Very moving. Now, the thing that I felt was interesting about it is that she didn't say, and maybe she didn't even realize, that she was going to the church. If you understand the church broadly enough, the man who commissioned the sculpture, as well as the woman who is portrayed, as well as the sculptor himself, they were all Episcopalians, and it's on land that was part of the glebe for that parish in Rock Creek. She probably didn't know any of that, or if she did, that was not necessarily the reason she said, "Oh, I have to go to some Episcopal shrine," or something like that. I think it is kind of more the subliminal way that our relationship with the church, our relationship with the art, with the liturgy, the things that pop into our minds at various times, it's subliminal, but I think it was very much there. Now, she also was with Lorena Hickok in that moment, and she came back kind of confronting the fear, acknowledging she didn't want to do it, and then came back and did it in spades. And as someone said, arguably the most significant first lady of all. That situation had been anticipated in other ways. When she was when FDR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, she was called upon to visit the insanity ward in the Naval Hospital, because there were a lot of people coming back from World War I they called it shell shock at the time, but now we would say PTSD. And she was horrified. She didn't want to do it, but she said, "But I'm the wife of the Assistant Secretary of Navy. It's my responsibility to do this." I'm reading it in 2025, and I'm saying, why did you have to do it? You weren't Secretary of the Navy, but that is how marital life was structured until really quite recently. We started to disengage from that, I think, in the 1970s, really, where we do not automatically assume that because your husband has a job, the wife has uncompensated responsibilities. But that was the world she lived in. So he was constantly, stepping into new roles, which meant she was stepping into a new role as well. And I think that the fact that she did it well, and that it was so helpful to FDR, And that in many ways FDR was helpful to her because she did realize a lot of her aims. Not the one that stands out that she didn't persuade him on. I mean, she persuaded him on it, but he wouldn't do it. Was the federal anti-lynching law. She was not successful in persuading him on that, although she did get him to speak out against lynching. But the thing is that there were many things that they did. She used to fill a little basket full of notes to him that she would send over to his bedroom before they went to bed, and they were things that she wanted him to do. And then he sent her a note and he said, "Eleanor, I must ask you to limit your basket to 3 items. If you give me only 3 items per night, I promise to do all of them. But I can't have this, this gigantic basket coming in every night." So she did that, and she very carefully decided, okay, these 3 things I really want him to look at. So they worked out those kinds of things in the relationship. And I'm looking at that and saying, I think that's love and respect.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Danny. We had a little trouble hearing them earlier, so they put their question in the chat. In 1940, in response to a letter she got after receiving the Churchman's Award, Eleanor wrote that she wasn't, quote, a very good churchwoman, wasn't, quote, particularly orthodox, and that her religion didn't depend on creed or church. By that point, she'd received a good bit of criticism from some church leaders for her views on race and social issues. Joseph Lash wrote in Eleanor and Franklin that her faith was, quote, deeply moral, but not especially doctrinal. Do you think that context was what influenced how she described her faith?
Yes, I think that, and also the fact that she really did have a genuine humility about herself. And in relation to Frances Perkins, who also had a lot of humility, Frances Perkins is on record saying, I shouldn't really be allowed to speak on matters of religion because I'm a follower, I'm not a leader in this regard, underestimating her theological skills. But Eleanor viewed Frances as somebody who was capable of doing things that Eleanor herself thought she couldn't do. She didn't know how to go in and settle a strike. She didn't know how to draft legislation or implement public policy, those kinds of things. So she kind of looked at her own work as sort of her feeble attempt to do something good. And I think that her suggestion, my faith doesn't depend on doctrine, or however she phrased it, I think that's kind of what I was getting at, of saying that's actually pretty true of Episcopalians. And it's especially true of Eleanor because she was so focused on the teachings of Jesus. That's where she doesn't really seem to have any doubt. If you want to talk about virgin birth, well, maybe yes, maybe no. That's not important to her. What is important is what Jesus asked of us. And I think she responded in spades.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
If others have questions, we still have, oh, here's one. Okay. This is from Jean. Going back to Eleanor Roosevelt's childhood, my understanding is that when she was summer living at Oak Terrace, she attended services every Sunday at St. Paul's and Trinity Parish in Tivoli, which is just about like a 35-minute drive from Hyde Park here. And afterwards visited the graves of her parents buried in the little parish's cemetery. Have you come across anything about this aspect of her religious history and its effect on her religious identity? The Christian faith certainly shared her moral center and social justice seeking. Was it also a place of consolation and quiet encouragement? And then closes by saying she always had an affection for Tivoli, and anyone who's been there, who wouldn't? So Thank you, Canon.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was very much a routine part of her life. She really was a churchgoer throughout her life. And in fact, in addition to Tivoli, She had a relationship with All Saints Cathedral in Albany, because when FDR was in the state legislature and then again as governor, they worshiped there. She also had a relationship with St. Luke in the Fields during the years after FDR died. She lived in the village for about 5 years and worshiped there. They had St. Thomas, Washington, DuPont Circle, where FDR was on the vestry, and St. Anne's Welsh Pool in Campobello, where FDR was an honorary vestryman. And there's actually a plaque there to that effect. So they really had a lifelong relationship to the church, and I think that the way it comes through is perhaps in some of these subliminal things where they're using a phrase that is actually right out of the Book of Common Prayer. They're not really quoting the Book of Common Prayer, but that's where it comes from. Now, in terms of how it affected her her solace, I spend some time, and it's speculative on my part, but I spend some time examining the visual aspects of the Church of the Incarnation, because that's where this 8-year-old, 10-year-old girl would be on Sunday morning. This is what she would see, what she would be looking at. And so I pull out some of the themes of the stained glass and the statuary and that sort of thing, and suggest how that might have influenced her. I think she had, I know that she, in addition to the graves of her parents, she also visited the grave of baby Franklin, who was the infant that died. That was a frequent thing for her. And I think she, despite the fact that she was mostly an extrovert, always surrounded by people and always wanting people around her. Despite that fact, I think she did go into these very quiet moments. It also seems that the way, and she did experience depression even as an adult, but the way she handled it was to plunge into more work. She would just do it, make yourself do it. She attributes part of her ability to do that to that routine of memorizing Bible verses from her grandmother, that it taught her how to give something your undivided attention for 15 minutes and then move on to something else. Many psychologists would say, well, the antidote to anxiety is action. Get up and do something. And that starts changing the the adrenaline or whatever it is, the lack of adrenaline, whatever is making you depressed. So she was not someone like Frances Perkins, who would go off to a convent even while she was Secretary of Labor, spend a whole day in silent retreat. I don't see anything like that in Eleanor's life. What I see, though, is kind of a continual recommitment to action as probably an antidote to depression, as well as a manifestation of her vocation.
Thank you. I'm gonna add a question to that. One of the stories we loved so much from the book in our book group here at St. James was after the work on the Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor coming home and skating. I think it was after the work on the human rights.
Yes.
And taking off her shoes and skating across the polished wood floor.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on how that kind of playful, I think of her as such a serious woman, how did this playfulness and joy sort of form part of her spirituality? And can you comment on how that playfulness or joy is sort of present in Episcopal spirituality?
Yeah, I think it was a very big part of her personality. And in fact, her grandchildren and her niece, Eleanor Roosevelt II, is her book is my source for that story about skidding across the hall. That they all claim that she had a wonderful sense of humor, and she was kind of a life of the party type person. And certainly that was characteristic of her father. Elliot Roosevelt was very much of a bon vivant and a playboy and that sort of thing. And they had a very playful relationship. You know, when he was not living with the family, but he would come to visit, she would slide down a banister to greet him. You know, that kind of thing. So there was always, despite the fact that she had to wear a brace when she was a child, she became very physically energetic, and she did a lot of physical work, a lot of nursing work, for instance, in her various activities. So she was always very active, and I think people just well, for instance, when she went behind enemy lines and was talking to the soldiers, she would sit down with them and she would ask them about where they were from and all that sort of thing, and if they had injuries, what that was about, and what the prognosis was. And then, do you have someone that you would like me to write to? And she would actually write letters to all these people. The military brass was against having her come in to she was in Europe, and then she was also in Guadalcanal. They were against it, but they found that she was so good for morale that then they started arranging additional trips. And of course, that was FDR's idea. He thought it would be good for Eleanor to go talk to these people, which says that he certainly understood something about her jovial nature. Now, one of the things that I think does relate to our Anglican spirituality and liturgical tradition is that one of her solutions over and over again for dealing with people who were in conflict or who just were not, there was no meeting of the minds, it was a hospitality solution, you know, and she would have them over to tea and just have them talk it out. Or she would throw a picnic, and her picnics were pretty spectacular. The one that occurred when FDR was governor of New York was for the Women's Trade Union League. Eleanor had become involved in that in the early 1920s. That was a coalition of trade union women and society women who were supporting them. They arranged this day at the Springwood Estate in Hyde Park, where these garment workers basically and other union women took a ship or a boat from New York City all the way up to Poughkeepsie, and then they were met by buses that took them up to the estate. They had 400 people there. You know, and they spent the whole day there, and they put on a pageant and all that sort of thing. And they also then got to meet with FDR on a one-on-one basis. And a lot of what they shared with him became the basis of his labor legislation as governor of New York State. That's really coming out of creating this hospitality. The other thing that she did that I think it's kind of funny, but I can see why it worked so well. She really couldn't cook. So she was not, you know, throwing dinner parties, but she knew how to scramble eggs. And so she used to have a chafing dish on the dining room table, and she would scramble eggs while she was talking to her guests, or sometimes it was just the family, and that was big enough as it was. Because they always had, in addition to having 5 children, they had a lot of grandchildren, and they were frequently either living wherever they were living or they were visiting them. So always big gatherings in which she's scrambling eggs and that sort of thing. And people love the informality of it, but it is still the idea. It's the kind of Eucharistic concept, is that around the table, some of those divisions that seem so important to us fall away, or we're able to focus on something that is maybe more important than that. So I think that she accomplished a great deal with that that first of all, there was a kind of calmness about her that we have to sit down and talk and share. And so teas, scrambled eggs, picnics, that sort of thing, that's her modus operandi. And I think it comes out of a Eucharistic spirituality.
Thank you. As you know, we regret that we aren't all together in person. And one of the things that I had discussed with one of our members was that at the reception that was to be today, we wanted to have a chafing dish and make some scrambled eggs in the parish hall.
It would have been wonderful. I would have been thrilled. That would have been great.
I think this will be, we're already a little over time, but can we ask one last question and then we'll
I have
speak
plenty
a bit
of time
about the
since
book.
I don't have to travel
Okay.
home. So.
So this question is from Doug, and Doug asks, Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins, and then another person in the chat said, and Dorothy Day also.
Yes.
So these are religiously grounded women whose work significantly impacted the development of the New Deal, and of course with Eleanor, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well. Your work argues that their religious training was a major factor in bringing about the New Deal. The question is, what was it about the New Deal era itself that allowed their religious and theological thinking to come to the fore?
Glad you asked that. I mean, there's actually a long answer to it, but I think I touched on it in chapter 3, is that the United States was undergoing a little bit of a cultural and religious shift in the early 20th century. New England had had a kind of cultural hegemony throughout the 19th century. And what was happening was that was shifting to New York. And there was a pre-existing culture in New York that was very different from the New England culture, which was, to the extent that it was concerned about community, it was about disciplining the community, okay, getting the community to shape up. In New York, the culture was more about providing for the community. And it was not as selective in terms of who's in the community and who is not. So it's kind of like a dragnet idea. And part of that is the fact that you had the Episcopal Church had this old Tory Anglican heritage. Trinity Church's charter in 1697 said that parish is responsible for the spiritual needs of all New Yorkers, whether they were members of the church or not. And about 2/3 of them were not. But Trinity took that very, very seriously. What then happens in the 19th century is New York is populated by the influx of Roman Catholics, beginning with the Irish in the 1840s, but by the end of the century, Polish and Italian and all kinds of Catholics, and then a big Jewish component as well, mainly coming from Russia during the pre-revolutionary, pre-communist period. So you have a huge population that shares some of those same ideas about communal solidarity and about providing for the community that the Episcopal Church shared. So that is significant, but also in terms of your larger question about, well, what was going on in the larger culture, is New York was becoming the cultural capital of the United States. Washington is the political capital, but New York became the capital city. It became the center of the publishing industry, the nascent radio, and then eventually, and film industry, and eventually television. It also had eclipsed Paris as the world leader in the fine arts. It was the center of theater. Okay, so you have all of this stuff going on that really, I think, is a very fertile soil for what the New Deal actually does. Theater, okay, well, we have a federal theater project that comes out of that, and that was something that certainly the Roosevelts had in their New York background, but also Eleanor was a personal devotee of the theater, lifelong theater goer whenever she could. A federal arts project, a federal writers project, a music project, all these kinds of things that valued the cultural dimension without discarding the industrial capacity of the country. It was very concerned about industry as well, but it saw the cultural activity as being equally important. I think that also relates to kind of the theological, communal, cultural perspective of Anglicanism, is that it's not just about preaching the right ideas, it's about acting them out. There's a great deal of theater in our liturgy. It's about the visual arts, sensory stimulation, reaching the individual through all possible sensory means, not one particular one or not one valued over others. So there's a sense in which, if I were going to put it in shorthand, I would say that the United States was becoming more Catholic in its perspective, and I use that term very broadly. But it was becoming more Catholic in a way that Anglicanism already was. The other thing that was happening is by the early 20th century, we were in a situation that is very close to what we are today, that we had a great variety of religious traditions here. And the Episcopal Church always took the idea that it was a leader of the religious community, not that it was supposed to be the one that was in charge of everything. And so it had an ecumenical flavor to it that really suited the times and eventually resulted in there was the Protestant ecumenical movement that's really leading up to World War II. But actually, when Eleanor was working on the Universal Declaration, the Catholic Church, participating in those talks, supported religious freedom as the first choice. That up until that time, it had been a second choice. You supported religious freedom if you couldn't get a Catholic state. So they supported religious freedom, and then 20 years later, with Vatican Council II, religious freedom becomes the standard, and the Catholic Church joins the ecumenical movement and affects a position not unlike the Episcopal Church's position, that we are in a leadership role. We're not necessarily the end all be all.
And a comment in the chat that you may want to expand on is her belief in the right to develop the human personality ties her to a view of the arts as not a luxury. Can you maybe expand a little bit on this belief in the right to develop the full human personality?
Yeah, I'm coming up blank with examples of it, but it certainly is certainly true. And I did mention her love of theater, and I think that was something that she shared with many of the New Deal personalities. I'm sorry, I'm not coming up with a lot of good examples of that, but I think that it's certainly there, that she saw that. Also, she did a lot of teaching. When FDR was governor of New York, she spent 3 days a week in New York City at the Todd Hunter School because she was the vice principal. And she was very concerned about the full development of personality and about exposing particularly girls and young women to things that they might not have been exposed to in a traditional education. She also, in her work at Valkill before it became her cottage and her happy home, it had been a furniture factory in which they were trying to do very high quality reproductions of classical American furniture. And so there was a strong aesthetic component to that work. It unfortunately did not work financially, so they had to shut it down. It was very similar to the arts and crafts movement in England, which also did this brilliant work, but it was so expensive. Then once it was finally done, it was so expensive nobody could afford to buy it. But it was a very good idea, and it certainly represented a commitment to the aesthetic side of life as something that is as important as the more nuts and bolts kinds of things. I like to point out that in the Eucharist we often get why there's bread, because that's basic to life. But why is there wine? Well, the wine is that little sip of pleasure that makes the world go round. So I think that Eleanor certainly understood that, saw that.
Thank you so much. I see, Arlene, I see you have your hand raised. I'm just going to pause here because I know some people will have to jump off. Donn, how can people get a copy of your book, Eleanor Roosevelt's Nightly Prayer, and also your book about Frances Perkins? And you shared with me also that you are willing to send a book plate, a signed book plate, to anybody who has purchased a copy of the book and would have liked to get it signed today. So can you tell us a little bit about how to find your books?
Yes. Well, first of all, they are both. If you do searches for any online retailer, they do come up. Some of them, the price varies on some of them. You can also go directly. In the case of Eleanor, the publisher is Morehouse, which is a subsidiary of Church Publishing. So you can go to their website and order it there, or you can get it from Amazon or other online retailers. My other book, Tread the City Streets Again, I self-published, which means it's not easy to get, although we do have a QR code where you can order it. You can also get it via Amazon and all the online retailers, but if you have philosophical objections to Amazon or would just like to eliminate the middleman, this goes directly to Ingram, which is the print-on-demand publisher of Tread the City Streets Again. Now, if you would like to have a signed copy, what we're doing is we're providing book plates, or I am providing book plates, in which I will write an inscription on there. If I know what you want me to say, I will say that. And the way you can do that is send an email to the church with your mailing address, your physical mailing address, and what you want me to say on the inscription, and then I will send you this little book plate that you can paste in the front as you might an ex libris or something like that.
Thank you, Donn. I have put the St. James Church's email address in the chat so folks can send an email to office@stjameshydepark.org with your mailing address and the inscription you like. And that is, thank you, because it's so generous, so lovely of you to do that.
Sure.
All right. Arlene, I'm going to go ahead and, well, hold on. I'm going to try. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute so you can share your question.
My question goes back to the furniture that Eleanor, she sponsored. I understood that was in Appalachia, and it was to help the people there to have a trade, to make a living.
Yes, that's a different project, though.
Okay.
Yeah, so she did that more than once, but the one at Valkill was actually something that she was bankrolling pretty much herself.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. One of the things in terms of that aesthetic question too, one of my colleagues on the board of the Frances Perkins Center is the Reverend Charles Hoffaker, who is a priest in the Diocese of Washington, and he and his wife live in Greenbelt, Maryland, which was a new town that was developed by the New Deal. And it's fascinating to visit it because it had thought through all of these niceties about what makes for a good community. It's not just that it was decent housing. Okay, it was that. But it was laid out in such a way that it was aesthetically pleasing, and they had walkways and bridges so that the children did not have to cross the street. You could avoid the traffic, that sort of thing. Very, very well thought out. And I think that when we're looking at the New Deal, it just the buildings that were created were aesthetically beautiful. And in fact, a lot of them have either Art Deco or Neo-Gothic themes, both of which are very common in New York City. So it's not just Franklin and Eleanor that are doing that, it's all the people who were hired. So many of the principals of the New Deal either were born and raised in New York City, or they went to school at Columbia, or they built their careers there. Harry Hopkins is an example of that, somebody who had a really brilliant career in New York City before going to Washington, even though he was from the Midwest. So I think that that aesthetic thing comes through. And I know that FDR in particular wanted Americans to be proud of their government and wanted them to be proud of the public sector. And that's why we got these beautiful post offices all around the country. Little small towns like Princeton has not just a beautiful post office, but with murals by local artists about local themes, you know? And so I think that was very important to the New Deal as a whole. And I certainly, when you look at all of the New York Episcopalians who were involved in it, I think you can see a correlation to the church's priorities as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for this book, which has been a gift to us at St. James, and I think to so many folks who have gathered here today. And thank you to everyone who's gathered. Yay.
Thank you.
At this time, we're going to close. I want to, as you mentioned, on another prayer so close to Eleanor Roosevelt's heart, the prayer attributed to St. Francis. So as a way of closing this time together, with real gratitude for you, I'll invite us to pray this prayer together. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. So thanks again to everybody. In just a moment, I'm going to turn off the stream to YouTube, and I'll sort of free up the muting restrictions on this room. So if folks wish to stay in this Zoom room, and if you have a final question or comment, you'll be welcome to do so. And let's just take one more moment to say thank you to Donn Mitchell. Thank you so much. All right, blessings, everybody, and thank